All right, I think we can go ahead and get started. My name is Aaron Kloss, and I'm the city planner for the city of Beverly. Thank you for taking your time and meeting today to discuss and be part of the City of Beverly Municipal Asset and Reuse Committee Advisory Committee. As you all know, we met about a month and a half ago, and we had a pretty wide-ranging conversation about what we're looking to do with this committee, and that we're looking for advice from this committee on how we could reuse and reorganize, if necessary, the city's capital assets, given the fact that the middle school is now under construction and Briscoe will be an asset that we have that's available to us, and we have some decisions to make. But before we get into tonight's agenda, I wouldn't mind going around one more time. We're all kind of getting to know each other. We could go around the table and introduce ourselves. Chris, can we start with you?
Sure. I'm Chris Silverstein. I am the Ward 3 School Committee representative and the current chair of the school committee.
I'm Janet Cresos, just citizen of Beverly, and I work for the Mass State College Building Authority, and I'm on the school building committee for the middle school.
I'm Brian Ailes, the finance director for the city.
Mike Wheeler, President and CEO of Beverly Bank.
Paul Guanci, City Council President.
Kevin Artunian, Chief of Staff.
Darlene Nguyen, the Assistant Planning Director.
Again, Aaron Clausen, Planning Director for Beverly.
Steve Frederickson, Director of Municipal Inspections.
Greg St. Louis, City Engineer.
Mike Collins, Commissioner of Public Services.
Ray Bouchard, Chair of the Planning and Building Committee.
Todd Surratt, citizen like Janet. I also sit on the Middle School Advisory Committee.
John LaLasha, Chief of Police.
Andy Goldberg, Goldberg Properties.
Thad Samasco, architect, resident, and also on the Middle School Building Committee.
John Hall, citizen representative and Beverly business owner.
Thank you, everybody. There is a sign-in sheet that's going around. Your name's already on it, so since you're here, if you could just initial it that way, you don't have to write down all your info, but that we know who's here. We're also being filmed, and we'll make this video of this meeting and the past meeting available. I believe that the city has a webpage already up. If you want to go back and review documentation that was presented at the last meeting, documentation that's been handed out now, as well as the initial meeting video, go ahead to the Beverly webpage. It's beverlyma.gov. On the bottom, there's a quick links that'll take you right to that. So you can, at your leisure, go ahead and go to that and learn whatever you possibly can about Briscoe School and the city's capital assets and where we want to go. So again, I just quickly, for this meeting, I'd love to just quickly restate what the purpose is. I think I've already done that, but if there's any questions around that, we can always put a fine point to it. We had a walkthrough last Thursday, I believe it was, there's about 10 of us can make it. I wouldn't mind getting some feedback on and what we saw and kind of just general thoughts on that, and particularly for others who have been there, to share with the rest of the group. And then, as I've handed out some material, we'll go over that material. This is based on a lot of the questions that were brought up the last meeting. Review that. And I think for the most important kind of takeaway for the next steps of this meeting is make sure we have all the questions that we need to answer. So I'll tell you when we go through the documentation and the information that's before you and available, it's not going to cover all the questions that were asked in the first meeting. We recognize that we're still trying to pull that information together. But as we go forward, I want to make sure that we are covering everything. So a key next step out of this meeting would be, are we covering all your questions and whatever that is, so that we can pull together a full suite of information for you. And then just a kind of general open conversation before we wrap up. So I don't expect it to be a terribly long meeting. As I said before, really what the mayor's asked this task force to do is take into consideration the fact that we're going to have a major asset that's available to us. Take into consideration that there are needs in terms of space for the police department and City Hall and other departments, how we can best utilize what we have available to us, and is essentially looking for advice from this committee on how we might approach the reuse of Briscoe, whether it's for city municipal purposes or not. So that's broadly stated what we're looking to do. Any questions on that? Before I go on to the next piece, I think it's pretty straightforward. Okay. We had a walkthrough the other night, Thursday, to just get a sense of the school and get a feel for the space and what's available. For those of you who were able to go to that, or those who have been in the building before, just any kind of major kind of takeaways from that you'd find useful or helpful for the committee in general? Dad?
I can offer that I went in with an open mind to hopefully trying to work with the building and as more of a restoration or renovation than a demolition. But it's clear that the layout is kind of a D shape. There's not a lot of exterior wall area. The hallways are wide and it's pretty inefficient building. It would be difficult to turn it into, say, private housing, I thought. It's been overrun by the building codes, as I think was reported, the mechanical, electrical, and plumbing codes and seismic requirements, even accessibility requirements would be difficult to manage. And while I view the building as a real treasure to the city in terms of exterior, it would be very difficult in my mind for its reuse, and maybe other than perhaps a school. So I don't mean to be a wet blanket, but I left less sure that its reuse, like a building like McKay was able to be reused due to how its geometry worked. I thought this one was a much more difficult project to put forward. It is built like a tank for sure, but that has good and bad parts to it. There's a lot of brick-bearing walls and masonry-bearing walls that would be hard to move. And yet those are not reinforced masonry walls, and therefore they need to be reinforced for seismic loading and so forth. I think it was as reported, there's a lot of hazardous materials in the building as well. So it's I think in some ways it's a beautiful piece of land encumbered by a building. In some cases it's a beautiful building, but it has been, I think, the codes in particular have kind of overrun its utility. That was my view, at least.
Thank you. Anybody else who's either been or...
Kind of follow up a question, Thad, if you don't mind? I mean, from a housing perspective, I think that makes a lot of sense. What about from like a commercial office use perspective? Is there opportunity there for that?
Yeah, I think that's more likely. But, I think the issue is really the amount of daylight that gets into the building. It's sort of shaped like a D with the top and bottom legs are a little bit narrow, and the auditorium, which is really quite a beautiful space, is right in the middle of the D, kind of connecting it across. So, that's a more likely use would be an office or something where daylight can be borrowed from fairly deep, across a space. The actual classrooms themselves would make wonderful apartments, so high ceilings, and the geometries are good, but there's really not enough classrooms. You'd expect almost a double loaded corridor to be more efficient, and there's very little of that in the building.
Thanks.
One person's view again.
One point I'd make that I noticed is that I was surprised, this being the first time I was in the building, to find that the theater space was actually in the center of the building, which is interesting layout. It makes for an interesting layout and how it kind of interacts with the school itself and as a school use. The one challenge that certainly does bring to it, back to your point, that kind of reusing it or repurposing it for residential, is it begs the question, how do you deal with that theater space if it's going to go to that use? It makes it a lot more challenging to kind of come up with a use for that that could potentially preserve it in that way. So I for some reason had thought it was part of the building that's out back, which is actually the gymnasium. It's not what it is. It's in the middle of the building. One thing I don't think we've made available that I'd like to, because I think it would help with context, and it actually has floor plans, is we were able to find at the Historic Society a pamphlet from, I think it's 1923, when the school was opened or thereabouts. And it has floor plans, and it has a short review of kind of the history of what happened politically and how the city at the time was able to get funds to build the building. At the very least, I think it helps provide context, but it also tells you and shows you at a floor plan level and then also site plan level how the building was laid out at least one time. It certainly has morphed a little bit from 1923 till now. Any other thoughts from that?
I have a copy of that if you need to scan. I can scan it. If you don't already have it electronically.
I do, but I might ask you for it because it's more of a photo.
Yeah, no, I actually have a hard copy.
You have a scan? Okay, that'd be great. Thank you. Okay. Anything else? Okay, we'll move on. If there's any other questions about what we saw as we can continue on, we can certainly go over that. So what I handed out tonight was an attempt to provide some information about, or to address information, questions that were raised at the last meeting. There's one that's a stapled sheet of 4 pages, or 2 double-sided, and essentially it's taking and combining a summary of data for each of the properties that we're considering under this review. So you got the City Hall, police station, and then the Briscoe Middle School itself. So, as an example, we get some information. Most of it we have for City Hall, but 199 Cabot Street, we have about 18,000 square feet, 500, built in 1785. I'm not going to go through this in point by point, but I think this will give most everybody here a fair amount of information of what the facilities are now, kind of where they stand. The police station, built in 38, it has 3 floors and a basement comprising about 14,000 square feet. So again, give you a sense of what's there. And then the Briscoe School itself. So I think this should give us a sense of what we're working with. We don't need to go through that completely now, but it's something to look at as we move forward. And then there's a spreadsheet that we started pulling that data together. As you might recall at the last meeting, a lot of the questions that were raised were what is the city's need? What are the city's needs? What are we using now in terms of square footage and where? And then not conversely, but in the future, thinking about what our needs might be 5, 10, 20 years down the line. What do we see our needs to be? So the spreadsheet is a start. It's basically giving on a per department basis. You'll see the department, location, staff, full and part-time, and then an estimate of the square footage for each department. This is just an estimate. We didn't go. This is not a measurement. I've gone through the practice of measuring plans. It's just kind of going through each department and taking a good look at it, and the number of offices and whether or not there's a conference use. So it tells us that outside of the departments that necessarily need to be located off-site or separately, we have about 25,000 a need. We're currently using about 25,000 square feet of space for full-time staff of 63, 13 part-time. Again, real rough. What we'll want to do is the next step of this is to kind of look at each of the departments and understand what are the real needs. So here's where we're at. What do we need in terms of space? And this whole exercise is to understand what is the total need, and is Briscoe an opportunity to provide for that need? If it is, we can explore that, I think, a little bit more. If it's too much space or if it's too little, well, no, I don't think it's going to be too little. I think we know that it's not, but this is a first kind of stab at that. And then the last piece that was handed out was the capital expenditure plan, with the proposed debt service requirements up to 2025. That's what we have. Any questions on these? I think we emailed these out last week, so hopefully you had a chance to kind of peruse them a little bit. Please.
So I just don't want to ask Bryant because he's sitting next to me, but does this seems to say there's no debt on Briscoe right now?
There's not.
Okay. Checking.
If I could just make an observation of some of these numbers that we're all trying to process here. It seems to me that there's a big difference between the available space, and I think this is something we all know, the available space at Briscoe and what the potential need is for the current city offices, which begs the question that was asked last meeting or 2 meetings ago before the tour of what the options could be with that excess space. And that resonated with me a little bit after the last meeting, so I did reach out to bond counsel earlier and got some clarification in the event that, that was an opportunity that we wanted to explore. The city can, in fact, rent space to private entities. The trade-off is that any work that would be done that we would seek to borrow funds for would need to be borrowed under a tax-exempt status, which typically, I'd say a rough difference is probably a percentage point. I don't know how accurate that is, but I don't know what today's markets are. It's just something to consider, that if we do want to explore that option as a possibility, we would really need to look at what the potential revenues might be to offset the increased interest costs over long term. So just food for thought, following up on some comments from last week or last meeting, and also just processing some of these numbers here. Because I think, in my mind, kind of a fatal flaw analysis says that this building's too big for just us, right? I think that's not a reasonable option.
I would say also with the school likely included as well, not just the city hall, but the
Right,
school.
with the school
If you
administration
include that at the
too,
building.
sure.
And so if I understood that correctly, we can bond to repair the building, make repairs, lease it to another, third-party entity. Unless it's a nonprofit use, we are supposed to higher interest rates. Is that essentially the?
I don't know with certainty about the nonprofit use, but I was under the impression that any type of revenue generation would exempt us from tax exempt status for that particular borrow, not for the whole city, but just.
So that'd have to be built into the pro forma. Okay.
Right.
I think we also talked at the last meeting a little bit about options around selling in a leaseback option, whether or not that's something we can do. I don't think we've looked at that quite yet, but that's another piece of information I think we want to track down.
We did look at it preliminarily. I spoke with some procurement officials in the city who also spoke with procurement officials outside the city and experts in that. We can structure an RFP pretty much how we want to, as long as it's fair and equitable. So if that's something we would build into the disposition RFP to say we're going to dispose of this building, however, we want you to lease back X number of square feet to the city at market rate, at a reduced rate, whatever the requirement would be, we would need to just be consistent with bidders and be fair and open in the process. But there's nothing to prevent us that I've found so far. So let me just say so far. And we would obviously, if that were something we continue to explore, we'd be seeking further legal counsel on that to just make sure we're not getting into trouble.
Aaron, could I just follow up on that? So I'm just using Andy as an example because I'm looking right at him, and his family is a developer. So it would be okay if we say sold Briscoe to Goldberg Properties. They went in, redid the whole building, built us a city hall, built us a police station, school administrative offices, put it all under one roof, and then we would have a long-term lease with something like that?
Yes, it's entirely possible. I think the one piece that we still need to figure out with certainty is whether or not you'd need to do it with prevailing wage or not. It would no longer be a municipal held asset, so we might not need to, but we'd check with legal counsel on that to make sure, because that's a whole different financial structure.
Right. Thanks, Brian.
Aaron, will you be performing a similar analysis to the police station as for public services? I know that's on the projected list here, and somewhat talked about them requiring additional land, if not other space.
That's a good question. So the question was whether or not we're going to be. You have the spreadsheet here where we're looking at the existing needs. We know from where the police station is now, they're using approximately 14,000 square feet. But I think the next step for building out this information and making some recommendations is what are the needs for the police department in terms of square footage of building, facilities within the building, and land area. Chief, I don't know if there's anything that exists to that end.
Mike and I talked about this. There were plans done up in 2004 that were never used
for a police station. And I think those were 35 or 40,000 square feet.
I don't remember the size of the building, but there's no question that, as we know, you can't design something like that without some sort of a space analysis and needs assessment. So we haven't reached out to the architect, but I would be shocked if they didn't have some such document. And it was done under a different administration. And so not many people within the city at the time were involved with it. So we don't know what the assumptions were.
And over 12 years, a lot of those plans have probably, the rules have changed, zoning has changed, we probably wouldn't be able to use those architectural plans.
No, but if we could start with that base.
The base, I think, was about 30,000 square feet.
Start with the needs assessment, and then see if you can revalidate that. Look at it under current standards, and with an eye towards accreditation and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, nowadays you have to fully cement poured cell blocks, all plexiglass. You can't retrofit anything. It has to be all new because it's federal code. You have to do a full build out just for the cell block area, say, and then evidence and everything else. But again, if you look at the current police station, when it was made in 1939, it was like 14 offices. With my part-time staff, clerical staff and everything, we have about 80 to 85 people with reserves. And if you're building a building you're going to be in for 30 or 40 years, you have to plan for 100. So you're taking 14,000 square feet built in 39, you're looking to 40 to 50,000 square feet for the future.
So I think one of the big questions that we still need to answer is just this key issue is what does the space need? And I think there's two scenarios that we want to look at is not just the needs, but what is the cost of new construction? Because I think we're going to assume that we would locate that in either a new property, or whether or not it could be accommodated hypothetically in Briscoe with a combination of both city facilities, city hall facilities and other departments, and kind of a cost analysis between the two. It'll imagine be a rough thumbnail sketch, but something that could give us a kind of order of magnitude.
Hey, Aaron, two points which is interesting. One is the prevailing wages and whether we could do this and sell the property to a private with a long-term lease back. And I don't know how many private individuals own police stations that they lease to the police departments or the fire departments. I don't know if there's any rules or requirements specific to that.
Question.
Your liability insurance alone would probably prohibit
be
it.
crazy. And whether you could subdivide a piece of that off and the city can keep the football field, or 4 acres back in the backside can build its structure versus the administrative buildings being in Briscoe and leasing out the rest of the property. But the prevailing wages, it's 40 to 46% differential between the prevailing wages and a private company building the same product, if you will. That's our experience. That's what we've seen in the marketplace. And it's significant. That's a significant dollar amount.
So there's a couple of things you just mentioned that I think are important. It's the prevailing wage piece, which is key, but whether or not if we're looking at a lease back option, what that means from a legal perspective or cost of additional insurance. You bring up a really good point that we did notice and talked a little bit about in the site walk on Thursday, which we haven't mentioned yet, is that it's a fairly big lot, and there is an opportunity to subdivide it, whether there's a number of different scenarios you can do that under, whether or not it's an adaptive reuse for the existing building for multifamily. There's still space in the back area that could be subdivided for additional lots if that was something that's worthwhile. Or in the scenario you just described where City Hall might take a portion of Briscoe in a buyback lease and then subdivide for a police station on the backside. Of course, there's also public facilities. There's not a playground, but a field in the back that we also want to consider. But it's a fairly large lot. It's zoned RMD, which is a multifamily zoning district currently, which allows some density. So there is an opportunity to subdivide the lot from the building itself as a way to help kind of come up with other kind of configurations to serve the needs. So I think it's a 7. I want to say it's a 7-acre lot.
8.
7 or 8.
The note said 8, I think.
And the other thing, we haven't really talked to Cummings Properties recently, but my understanding was there was 2-acre parcel put aside there for a police station back again in the early 2000s. So if that opportunity is still there, that's 2 acres of land that would not, cost the city revenue to build on.
And I think part of that, kind of that scenario for the police department, particularly in identifying your needs and opportunities, would be confirming whether or not that we still have access to that. I'm pretty sure we do, but pretty sure it's not good enough. We'll get confirmation on that. Ray?
There was a needs analysis done for both the fire and police department. There are a set of plans and specs for the building. It was designed twice.
We have the plans and specs, but
Yeah, you don't have the needs assessments.
Are you talking?
It's all included, and I turned over all that information to you in your engineering department.
You're talking about that parcel in front of Cummings property on Elliott Street?
That is
correct?
owned by the city.
Yeah, right.
What, for $1?
So
it's been recorded, if my understand, it's been recorded at the registry.
And you're saying there's a design and needs analysis for both fire and police for that property?
Yes.
Okay. We'll locate that and make that available on the webpage as well.
Yeah, I mean, I have the old architectural plans, but I don't have the needs.
yeah, we have the plans and specs. And I said, I know that you can't design a building like that without a needs analysis. I know it's been done.
So just quickly, hopefully you've had a chance to look at the spreadsheet. Other than what we've been talking about with respect to the police department and future needs analysis for each department. So where would we go if we had an option to grow? Each department could use a little bit more space, determine what the future needs are. So you have police, you have different city departments. We also want to get some data with respect to the school department, admin. Anything else that we should be thinking about as we're pulling this data together, or that questions that you have that you would like us to?
Aaron, I get one more question. What is the capacity of the city with the limitation of raising taxes to, 2.5% for additional debt service going forward? I see the capital expenditure plan here. How much more capacity do we have in this municipality based on the stuff you already have planned to what we need or propose in the future?
Very limited. Right. We have very, very limited excess levy capacity. We're essentially 40,000 or 50,000 under, which is basically nothing.
Right.
And the public safety building is built into our long-term plans, as you can see there. And we're not able to take on that permanent debt in that scenario until 2024. However, this is an older version. We're in the process of updating it right now. So we think that date will move up at least 1, possibly 2 years earlier in being able to permanently borrow. Now, that doesn't mean that we're not able to either accelerate the project prior to permanently borrowing, and you permanent borrow after the project's done, and you take out short-term bond anticipation notes as you work through the project and the design phase of the project. But they're really, aside from what you see there's really limited excess capacity. There are a couple key points in the near future that could create excess capacity, and that really is market rates are at the time we go to permanently bond for the middle school.
Right.
So we've made assumptions in all of our scenarios that the coupon rate or the gross interest rate on the permanent borrowings are going to be at 5%. What we're seeing in the market now are net interest rates, which is a different, and I'll explain that in a second, in the 3s. So that means typically the most recent ones we've seen have been gross interest rates of 5%, which means that's what you have to budget for and that's what you have to pay. But they rebate you a significant portion up front, creating a net interest cost to the city somewhere in the 3s.
So would you, and I just have one more question, would it be better for the city to pay a lease or pay a capital expenditure? If you had a choice, dollar for dollar. Does it matter?
I mean, budgetarily, dollar for dollar, I think it's very similar. I mean, if people that are more experienced in the leasing world than I am have some perspective on that, I'm all ears. But, you know, from a budget perspective, if it's, you know, $1 million a year for a capital expense or $1 million a year for lease, it's still $1 million of taxpayer money every year.
I suppose the only benefit there potentially is that if you're leasing it rather than bonding for it, and you have a problem with your bond cap, you could continue forward with a project.
We're fine with our bond cap.
Yeah.
Like, we've got room to borrow more money. It's more a budgetary constraint than anything.
It's a cash flow issue, right? Based on tax increase in taxes.
Okay.
Exactly. And as many of you know, close to 80% of our revenue is capped at 2.5% growth every year.
I think the lease idea, I mean, we struggle with this all the time, like, you know, why are P3 so popular now? Like, it seems like, you know, you lease or buy, why wouldn't you buy a car or, you know, or property? But I think it's the creative element that we don't even know if it's there or not. For instance, if you were to build a building, we would have to build a small building, but if a private entity could get the, you know, the value of scale to be able to build something bigger where they're getting other revenue with a guaranteed revenue from the city, there may be some creative advantage there. You know, but nothing's definite, it's just something to consider. You know, there has to be some reason that it's a big initiative with the governor and many other state agencies.
Yeah, the 3P, just for everybody who may not have heard that, it's a public-private partnership. It's a more common way of public and private entities working together to solve major capital and infrastructure problems that's difficult for either it's municipal, state, some governments to really address and fund. That reminds me of the last meeting. I think we talked a little bit about this and talked about Salem. The city of Salem has a building that they're leasing, that we believe they might be leasing back. It might make sense for us to kind of explore and look at some case studies around this P3 concept of a similar type, if there is such a thing. Is anybody aware of a project in the region that we could look at? We could do a little research, but I mean, other than the Salem, which is a pretty small annex, and I'm not sure what the relationship there is, but.
Would we be restricted on this, on the Briscoe site particularly because of the zoning? Like, would need zoning relief to make an office building there?
There would be zoning considerations, yes. I think if you're going to do straight office, there is a kind of a reuse special permit that the planning board can issue, is what was used for the McKay School, that allows a component of it to be office or commercial, but it's a pretty small portion of it, if I recall correctly. So, I mean, if this is an idea, but I think at this stage, at kind of this point, it's worthwhile looking at all of the options. And if one of the recommendations out of this is that, you know, because of the building and the challenges with the space and its design doesn't work very well for residential reuse, but works pretty well or rather well for office or commercial type use where we could get some benefit from lease back, I think it'd be worth looking at a proposed zoning change. I mean, if it's something that works for the city that benefits the community more largely, I think we can look at a rezone as long as it's, you know, it's something that we can go through a larger public process with.
And we get a lot of residential units going up in Beverly or planned in Beverly or in the process in Beverly. You know, part of the process, or part of my thought process, is that it'd be nice to have some sort of economic engine to be included in this redevelopment or reuse in our thought process, so we can attract more people to come to Beverly, utilize the services downtown and everything else. Residential by far is great. My bank does really well making money on that stuff, but when you're looking at the big global picture, I think it's important to take in consideration what it is you're actually bringing to the city and the added use to it.
So you're thinking about uses that would be a part of the larger economic development mix, right? Yeah.
It's an opportunity.
Yeah, I think so. And one of the things that jumped out at me, you know, kind of thinking a little bit maybe more out of the box in terms of uses, is there's a fairly large, you know, shop, you know, where kids are learning, you know, how to machine, how to use, you know, table saws, that sort of thing. is there an opportunity? We've, in the planning department at least, looked at ways and places and locations where we could have what's called a maker space or a co-worker space. It's a kind of a new concept that you're seeing in economic development where people or small businesses don't need to invest in equipment. They can share the space, they buy into it. And it's a great part, just kind of vibing off your economic development concept. There's something there that might be worth consideration where a maker space or an incubator that could help with advanced manufacturing, 3D printers, something that really could go along those lines. Because there are certain spaces, that building, that would actually fit fairly well for that. There's certainly a cost to that. But that's just something that jumped out at me when I was walking around. Dad, you had a question earlier.
Your initial question was there other information that might be useful? I thought, and that sort of related to what was you were just talking about, I think getting some understanding of what the underlying zoning does allow and would be useful. Those of us in the zoning world know it probably pretty well, but there's a lot of folks in the group that probably are not aware of what the limitations of the current zoning are and what the opportunities might be for a zoning change and what that process is like. That might be helpful as we look at alternatives.
Sure. So just real briefly, I'm not going to answer that question completely, but since people are here, RMD is the zoning district for which it's located, is a multifamily zoning district, allows a fair amount of density. It's other than single family, two family, or multifamily, there's not a lot of things that you can do there that aren't exempt from zoning generally. Zoning is a locally adopted law and regulation. It's regulated by Mass General Law, Chapter 48. It's a zoning enabling act that basically tells communities what are the rules of the road, what can you and what can't you do, and how can you regulate land use, and how can you regulate density, and how can you regulate design and mitigate impacts from that. As far as a zoning change, it's a city council change, it's a legislative change. It takes 2/3 of the legislative body to approve any kind of zoning change, and typically best practices is that any zoning change would follow a public process that would go along the lines to achieve or meet objectives that are identified either in a master plan or a neighborhood plan or any other kind of land use or economic development, transportation policy document. So that's what I said earlier. I think there's an opportunity at this stage, as we're kind of talking through ideas and thinking, I think at a 30,000-foot level, what are the opportunities? What could we achieve? What kind of objectives could we meet? If it takes a zoning change, I think we could consider that. It just takes a little time, and there would, again, need to be a public process informing the public about what that change might mean for their neighborhood and the city more generally. So, but we'll put that together. That's a fairly simple thing to do, one sheeter.
And I think it's important if the building was chosen to be disposed of privately, not knowing what the city would allow from a zoning perspective puts a pretty big damper on the ability to maximize the value return to the city. So you kind of have to have that figured out, I think, if you're going to do a public disposal of the asset.
The zoning, if there's going to be any zoning change.
Sure. A developer facing uncertainty is going to provide less return to the city than one who knows, what might be allowed.
I think that's a fair point. Absolutely.
In theory, we could change the zoning before we sold it, right?
I think that's what Dad's suggesting we'd want it to do before we even put it out to RFP. Yeah, and I think as far as, and I'm not suggesting that's the path we take, but if there is a particular use that we want to pursue that does require zoning change, there would be public process around that before, and would need to take place before an RFP goes out, because to Dad's point, any developer is going to want to know what the expectations are before they get themselves involved with it. I agree.
So at the last meeting, I had suggested that subdividing the property might be one of the mechanisms that we could consider in order to keep the building and reuse some of the land, or what I would expect a developer to do of their own accord should we sell the whole 8 acres. One of the takeaways I got from our site walk was a point by Thad that the gymnasium you wouldn't retrofit at all into housing.
Right.
In general.
Right.
So,
correct.
One of the concepts I would like to look at would be subdividing the property short of the gymnasium, which would save some additional land that you could use for parking or buffer or landscaping or whatever, what have you. So I've started putting together some of the existing conditions for the property just to look at different by right uses that we might anticipate. And then if there's discussion regarding to rezoning to a higher and better use, then we can look at those options too.
I think what would be really helpful in the short term is, as we endeavor to put together a summary of zoning and what that means, what we could do is take your analysis and attach to that so people in the committee and the broader public can see what that means in terms of potential reuses under the current zoning regime. I think that would be something we could do.
Well, that's an assumption question, but if you did put a police station on the property anywhere in the 7 or 8 acres, or, you tear up the gymnasium, you put it in the back of where the buses are now, which they'll be gone, because it's public services, you have to rezone it for that type of facility, even though it's residential. Are we exempted?
Pretty much the city is exempt for the public services, so,
Yeah, a lot of times that's a by right across the board.
yeah, typically it's a by right.
That's what I thought. I just want to make sure.
We want to be thoughtful about where we're locating things, but yeah, typically cities are exempt and towns.
From a business standpoint, Chief, does the Bristol location, is that a more favorable location for our headquarters as opposed to Elliott Street? Do you have a preference?
We've looked at it for other reasons, in particular, our ambulance response, and it's pretty much the center of the city. But again, I have police cruisers in every ward in the city. We work out of the cars, and not necessarily the building. So for us to respond to a scene, we're all throughout the city anyway. To have the building, a lot of people like a police station downtown or like it's centrally located only because the majority of the people there, that they conduct business there. But I've also been in areas where they've built a police station well outside of the city, which will afford you much more privacy, much more parking. So there's pluses and minuses to all of it. But I mean, Cumming Center is just as easy to get to as the Briscoe property, and for us. I know there was some concerns. I mean, Chief Scott is not here, but he had some concerns with the tracks. If they had, engine runs, it'd be more difficult for them to respond to areas of the city from that spot than a police cruiser, which can get around those pretty quickly.
There was a separate study done on response times.
Yeah, we have talked, Chief Carter and I have talked about that at times.
Is the desire to have both police and fire under the same roof on a new construction project? Is that the way the city wants to do business with respect to those?
I don't think any decisions have been made.
No, I don't think there's it's not something that we're looking to achieve. I mean, if it makes sense, maybe it makes sense, but it's not it's certainly not a requirement as we go forward. Yeah, I mean, there's different needs there. So
yeah, and the what's the term they use? Multi-use public safety buildings. There's literally a firewall, security doors. You're on this side, I'm on this side. Literally, it's a line right down the middle, and the two operations do very different business, and they do business very differently. Right. So, it's almost like you're just roommates, the odd couple, however you want to say it.
Yeah, I mean, in prior employments, we shared space with the Highway Department of Transportation, New Hampshire, and we had common spaces we had together for usage, and then we had our separate areas also. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think the only benefit, this is just me thinking through right now, is that there's an economy of scale of building and building at once.
Absolutely.
There's really no benefit of joining for that other than that reason.
Just have to go higher in the sky.
Ray, that analysis that you mentioned, the response time, Ray, that response time analysis, was that part of that work that was done?
That was done separately by
That's separate?
the former commissioner of both public fire department and the police department.
That I've seen.
You've seen that?
I know that's around.
Okay. We'll pull that together too. See what uses.
That's a whole different can of worms that I don't think you want to interject into this discussion. Trust me, it's a very controversial issue.
Okay.
How old is it? Is it even valid anymore?
It's probably city hasn't 2004. Yeah.
Railroad tracks are still where they were then.
Low bridges, and
Thad, you had a
I think
point?
Ray and I were both on the joint committee for this.
Yes.
And if I recall, it was kind of sold like there could be some joint use of space and therefore it could be a more efficient building, but I think the realities of that didn't prove true. So there may be some economy of scale in construction, but operationally, there didn't seem to be a whole lot of overlap.
No benefit.
These guys have guns, the other guys and gals have
Have axes.
hoses. It's not necessarily a great combination.
Not the same thing.
It's probably only gotten worse since 9/11. Was it 2002, Ray, that we were,
I think it was that.
yeah,
I'm not absolutely
so
sure.
it was a ways back.
No, it was a long time ago, and it wasn't met with enthusiasm by either the police department or the fire department. And you had a chief and a fire chief and a police chief that were behind the idea, but the rank and file always found an issue with everything that was brought up.
Okay. I'll leave it at that. Is there any other, so the kind of question I pose, is there any other pieces of information that you feel we need to pull together for the next meeting to help kind of lay out the options better?
I'm just not clear about the McKeon School. Is there excess capacity there, or is that?
McEwen?
Yeah, McKeon, sorry.
I don't
No.
know.
Okay.
In fact, if anything, that would probably get a little tighter, right?
Yeah, that's the projection.
That's in, what's there?
Right now, it's preschool and the school administrative offices.
So part of what we need to do, and I don't think we have it in here, but as we'll, for the next meeting, is look at what could happen. You know, is there an opportunity to, again, consolidate that at Briscoe with other city departments and what that means for that building? So we'll at least get a sense of what are the needs and how much growth and projections. And Chris, maybe you could help us gather that information.
Sure.
Aaron, if this is helpful to Janet's question, the central office operations for the school district are in McEwen, as is the preschool. As Ms. Silverstein said, I think there are 9 preschool classes. The expectation is that will only grow. The preschool operation is really driven by special education law. We're required to provide preschool for students on IEPs, and they're required to be offered in ways with what they call typically developing peers, so that leads to the need for X number of classrooms in any given year. The expectation is that demand will grow, and at some point it might start to squeeze out the central office staff. Thus, when we look at Briscoe, and I know there's a lot still to be sorted, but one of the threshold questions about whether Briscoe is a viable site for the city to hold on to, you look at, could we move all municipal operations into one place? Could we move all of the school department central office administration into one place? Could we find space within that footprint or on that campus for a new police station? So all those things which would become moot if the determination is that Briscoe is not a viable asset to hold on to, but that's really, and I know I walked in a little late from another meeting, so I don't know how much you said about that yet. But I know that's really the kind of the threshold decision, right?
Correct.
You said one other question. I don't think it's information gathering, just a thought. We've been talking about potentially moving all of city offices out of City Hall to Briscoe, as theoretical. What about the economic impact of having City Hall vacating that location? What happens to the downtown? Is that something that you're thinking about? Is there an economic analysis around that?
It's a hand-in-hand conversation. It only becomes relevant if you folks determine that Briscoe is worth a closer look. I shouldn't say worth, but if there's a potential viability to holding on to Briscoe and rehabbing it for use for these other purposes, then we take a deeper look at other issues like that.
And there are 64 people that are full-time at City Hall. And, if you're moving them, that would have an economic impact on downtown, but it could also benefit the Gloucester Crossing businesses as well. There's always that trade-off.
And in addition to that, we probably get, I'm just thinking out on the first floor where I operate out of, we probably get anywhere from 100 in an average day to, a peak day where we get maybe 500 people coming through. Maybe, and when it's tax bill due time.
I could tell you the coffee shop across the street does well.
I've never gone to City Hall without getting coffee.
Right. And I think one of the other, as the mayor said, is if we look and have determined that Briscoe might be viable for reuse, I think the other piece of information that would be helpful is what is the viability for reuse of City Hall? So if we're talking about displacing or replacing the police and city staff to Gloucester Crossing to Briscoe, we now have a building that is pretty attractive for a couple things that we can think of, and it's been talked about quite a bit. A hotel, maybe more residential, office. So, I mean, I see that, and Andy talking about drooling now. I mean, you see there's opportunity there with that building for reuse. I think what we would want to understand is what is the market telling us what could be utilized for that.
Just to be clear, the assumption is that the Briscoe structure is going to be viable. I mean, if the city owns 8 acres, continuous acres, that site is definitely viable for something. It's an asset to the city, absolutely. If the structures can't be utilized, it has to be knocked down and something else is going to replace it. I mean, is the goal here to justify the Briscoe structure as usable, or just determine that it's, and then go from there? If the structure's not usable, does the city intend to dump that whole parcel and do something else? Or is it going to retain that 8 acres or portions of that acreage and reuse it?
I'll let the mayor answer that question.
Yes, there are no preconceptions here.
Okay.
Some of the things that you'll look at when you look at the condition of the building and what it would cost to rehab it for our future use, you may look at how would that compare to how a private sector developer might be able to rehab it. Do those costs compare? You also, will need to look at opportunity costs. If we were to determine, for example, that here's another question. Can we afford to hold on to all 3 assets? Briscoe, City Hall, Police Station. It's a fair question, right? If we were to determine yes, that's a different conversation than no, we can't really afford as a city to hold all 3, so which one or more than one become surplus in our eyes, right? And if so, that property brings revenues that may help bring another property forward to a future use. If we determine that we need to build a new police station in a new place, that's a cost that's built into our capital plan. If we were to determine that we could do that at Briscoe, now you take that money and you apply it to the cost of making Briscoe work for us for the future. So you start, comparing off costs and benefits in that sense. But that's among the conversations that you folks need to dig through to determine what to recommend on that front. Does that make sense?
So I'll just kind of quickly go through this, a list of some of the next pieces of information we want to compile for you. So that's to fill out the space needs for the city departments, as well as the school admin piece, McEwen, or what is the projections there in terms of need. Do some or pull some analysis from the police department or the building that would potentially house the police department, so that we have that available. Look at a little bit more closely opportunities around a sell and lease back. Can that be done? How does prevailing wage play into that? And then also, as far as I think that was it. Oh, as far as, I think, Bryant, you answered the question about bonding in the case of what that means if we're going to lease space to a private property owner. an office user. So I think we have the answer to that, but if we need more clarity, we can at least put it down on paper so you have that. And I think what that would look like is just a short summary in bullets maybe of what are the options of ownership. Us leasing to somebody else, or selling lease back, or us utilizing it completely, or selling the property in fee. So we'll kind of explore those a little bit. An updated capital, I know Brian's working on an updated capital plan. Do you have a sense when that would be available for the next meeting maybe, or?
Depends on when the next meeting is.
Maybe we'll build it around that.
Yeah.
But since we have one that's in process, we'll provide an updated one that shows you really what our capabilities are in terms of debt service.
It would need to go, just for procedural, it goes to the city council. Placed on record that it's available to the public.
Right. Look at some examples or identify any P3 opportunities. Again, this is related to the kind of sell and lease back. What are any case studies we can look at that might inform some of our thinking? And then a zoning analysis looking at the site, what's developable there under the current scenario. And then Greg has got some build out that he's preparing that we can attach to that just to give some visual context to that. Am I missing anything?
I think it might be good to maybe just look at some maybe outside the box ideas of what developers have done with old school buildings.
School buildings.
Something maybe that we're not thinking of, or just
Okay.
creative type use.
Well, we can certainly do that. We'll look at case studies for the P3, but also just
Yeah, I can look into some.
if you've got examples, and anybody, if you run across something that you see that you find interesting or might be relevant, feel free to send it to me, and I'll go kind of sift through it and make it available.
So just very simple math. For 144,000 square feet, if you use $200 a square foot to rehab the property to get it up to code, you're talking $29 million plus the acquisition of the building. That's a significant number in a big space to lease out over an extended period of time. So as we kind of go through this process, you get really focused on the economics of it. I mean, great ideas, great concept, but that's a big number to fill in a short period of time.
And you're talking, this is from a private development
From even a private or the city.
Yeah.
And that was using $200. If the city did it, it'd be $400 or $300, a bigger number.
Right.
That's a big number.
Brian, when you were talking about leasing, were you just talking about leasing the land, or were you talking about leasing the building? Similar to like the RFP we're going to write for the harbor.
I mean, the perspective I was bringing was that it would be leasing a portion of the actual building. And just a hypothetical, if the city were to spend $29 million, borrow it, not tax exempt, and then we determine it's more space than we need, what's the economic windfall of leasing a portion of that building back and basically be a landlord? And whether or not that offsets the increased interest costs. That's all I was kind
But
of
you could also do just a lease of the 7.5 acres and get, if the property was gone, just lease the whole 7.5 acres and also collect back tax revenue from any property built on, correct?
Yeah, I think there are limitations to the length of leases that the city can enter into. I believe it's like 25 years maximum, but I don't know if that's if we're the leasee or the leaseor. There are some limitations there that we'd need to explore.
And Chief, I think as far as an RFP, I think what you're talking about is if we were putting it out to bid for somebody to
Come in and
purchase,
build their own
rehab,
structure,
and
but we just lease the land and
lease back from them.
then regain the taxes from whatever goes on the property.
Okay. All right, so we'll go to work and pull some of this data together. Again, for all of you who weren't here, just reiterate, we have at the city's main page, beverlyma.gov, if you go to the bottom, there's a quick link that will have a lot of the data that we've pulled together thus far, and we'll upload more as we go along, as including that 1923 floor plan and a short description of the history of the history of the building. We'll make that available as well, so there'll be some interesting reading at the very least. So we'll work on that. Before we wrap, I just want any other general questions, thoughts, comments before we keep going to the kind of scheduling our next meeting? Good. All right. We've got a lot of work to do internally. I'm thinking that we won't schedule a date right now because I want to figure out how long it might take us to pull this information together. I want to make sure at the next meeting you have something that we can look at that summarizes all this. So, I'm thinking July. We'll avoid July 4th, I promise. But we'll send out a notice to get some dates that works for everybody, so we can all attend to that. But I'm thinking at least 5 to 6 weeks before we meet again. All right? Thank you.
Thank you.
How about that?